Retired OBGYN and chair of the South Carolina Council of the Holocaust. She is also the president of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. Her parents, Ben and Yaja Stern, settled in Columbia after World War II. Anita Goldberg Zucker is the CEO and chair of the board of Intertech Group, one of the largest family-owned companies in the United States. Her parents were Rose and Carl Goldberg. Her parents settled in Jacksonville, Florida, where she and her two sisters were raised. Later, Anita and her late husband, Jerry Zucker, moved to Charleston and built their extraordinary business here in the city. Also, David Popowski is an attorney in Charleston. His parents, Paula and Henry Popowski, settled in Charleston and raised a remarkable family here. Each has just an extraordinary story. We'd advertised a fourth guest, my friend David Rothberg, whose family employed one of the early Holocaust survivors, Felix Goldberg, and had quite a story to tell. And we had to tell David, frankly, that what these three children of the survivors have so much to say, we would never get to him. And David has generously agreed to join us on another session when we do this, and we appreciate his willingness to participate and to give us a little more time here to try to do the best. Robert always says we have this extraordinary riches of all these
embarrassment of riches.
Embarrassment of riches in this story, and you'll hear it, is just extraordinary. So without more, let me just before we discuss the life your parents made in the United States, and I'm talking to Anita, David, and Lily here, we need for you to describe briefly their extraordinary journey during World War II and the miracle. It's just a simple miracle of their survival. So Anita, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Robert and Richard. And Richard, thanks. This is a great program. Carl and Rose Goldberg were my parents. My father was one of 6 children. 4 perished along with his parents. They were born in Zlujimia-Volinsk, by the way, both of my parents. And my father's sister, who was the only survivor besides himself, went to Palestine in the 30s before the war. My mother, Rose Mebab Goldberg, was one of 7 children. 4 perished along with her father, and her mom and 2 baby brothers and my mom and a niece survived. And so when you think about it, life was just unbelievable. My mother was born in 1923, my father in 1912. And by 1939, things were extremely difficult. My mother always says I had a traditional family. We did all the right things. But the one neat thing about my grandmother that I want to mention is how she made sure she got orphans married off, and she was a matchmaker, and she tried to raise funds for the different weddings to make sure the orphans could have weddings. But my mother and my grandmother were amazing bakers, and my mom worked with her father and her father's business. But in 1939, the Nazis came, there were bombings. My father had a wife and a daughter, and they were murdered in that bombing, in one of the first bombings. And my father found their bodies when he was digging to find them in the rubble of what had been their building. And then by the fall of 1941, the Nazis forced all of the Jews of Ludmir into the ghetto. It was in a commercial district of town, bordered by a river on one side and a high barbed wire fence on the other. But my family was very lucky, the Mebab family, because their civilian business, they had a millinery business, one for the military and one for civilians, but the civilian business was right in the middle of the ghetto. And so my family had a 1-room part of that business that they were given. So 16 people had straw mattresses in that room. And my mother was incredible. She was a very strong woman. She was forced to do hard labor. So they'd come get her from the ghetto every day and take her out to work in Nazi homes and digging potatoes in the fields that were frozen, cleaning the Nazis' homes, carrying human waste out of the ghetto. She did whatever she had to do. And if she was lucky, she might get a cup of watery soup on her way home from her work that night. but she would go to her family. And, you know, think about her age. She was maybe 15, 16 years old when this all began. My father was a translator. He worked with the Germans' forces. And at one point he got ill and he ended up in the same part of the ghetto with my parents. So my mom befriended him. She knew him before the war, but, you know, she was a lot younger, and she helped, get him back to health. And then in 1942, the first action by the Germans came, and they began to kill. And they killed my father's father and his three brothers. They were murdered. And my mother's brother, Bensi, and her sister, Ruffel, were murdered at that point in time. And then the next action came in 1943, and my mother's oldest brother was shot and killed. And his wife was also killed. Well, in 1943, the Nazis did come to do Judenrein, to cleanse the ghetto, and they took everyone out of the ghetto, including the room my mother's family was in. Well, my mother fell underneath a straw mattress and they didn't find her. And so when the coast was clear, she got up and she saw all of her family being taken, but then she found her niece. Her niece was 16 months old, her niece Esther, and she carried her around. And my mother's father had created hiding places. So my mom got her. She didn't know what happened to the rest of the family that had been removed, but one of her younger brothers escaped from the transport truck. And then there was one who was 7. He got off the truck, but he got my grandmother off because the Nazis were busy running around killing people and trying to round them up to put them on the transport. So they escaped. And my little brother was, my mother's little brother was so smart. He took my grandmother, they got in a shed and they covered themselves with wood, and they were not caught. But they all knew where the hiding places were. So when my mother got there with the baby, she finds her baby brother, who's 7, with her mother and the 8-year-old brother. And they're all there. And one of the uncles of my mother's family did not want my mother to come in with the baby. But finally, the person who was in there with them relented and let them all in. And my mother promised she would move them. And so one by one, she moved them to the next hiding place every night. During the below zero weather, my mother would take one person at a time and get them to the next hiding place. They hid in the cellar of a woman's home for 24 hours. That's all she gave them. But there were potatoes there, so at least they ate raw potatoes that night. But Wanda's father was a Polish policeman, and they knew they couldn't stay there. So they just kept going. And my father was a partisan, so he was wherever he was fighting with the partisans and doing whatever he could be doing. So ultimately, they get to a farm around the end of 1943, 1944, and they go underground. The farmer allows them to live under a hole in his barn, and they were there for quite some time until the Germans finally got to that house. And the farmer's name was Shemitsky. We never found him, we searched. But my mother was there. My father found them for a short time and stayed for a little while, but then he had to go back to the partisans in the woods. But my mother was there, her 2 baby brothers, her mother, this baby, and a cousin who had survived. They were all together in this little hole. So they were in a, think about it, the ghetto that they were from had 35,000 Jews. At the end of the war, there were only 200 left, and 7 of them were my family. Really amazing story. The journey, how they got the strength to do this, I have no idea. But my mother was the one who took them every night and moved them to the different shelters. And my mom had to get out of the ground at one point and she just couldn't breathe. So she climbs into the loft of the barn and they hear gunshots and squealing, the family, and they're not sure what's happened. Could it have been Rose? Could they have killed my mother? They find out later that the Germans had come, they killed a pig for food. And eventually when my mother saw the coast was clear, she went back down. But at that point, the farmer was afraid and he said, I'm really sorry to have to do this, but you have to leave. And so that's 1944. They had to leave. They slowly make their way back to their town. Okay, they weren't that far, but they were far enough that it was difficult. Because it was nearing the end of the war, at least in Blue Jiemiash Volens, where they lived. And they get back there, they find my mother's, shell of a house. And there were Russians living in it. And so they allowed my parents to come back in, but there was nothing left. Ultimately, my father found them again. He knew that my mother was alive and she had heard that he was alive, and they got married in 1945 in that house. And then they continued on their journey because they needed to escape the Russians after that. And they go in a double wall truck, and they make it ultimately through Poland into Germany, and they get to Berlin, where they have to get out of the truck and they make it to a DP camp. And it's, to me, again, the resilience, the fortitude, the perseverance, the strength that they had to have was amazing. And my mother's two little brothers were just unbelievable that they were able to help as young as they were do this. And I mean, these were all young people. They weren't even teens. My mother was a teen. She's carrying a 16-month-old baby who's, eventually older during that period of time. Both of her parents have been murdered. And just think of the journey. My grandmother was like a vegetable. She lost 4 children and her husband in that time. My grandfather was murdered in a shul that was burned. He had gone to say prayers for his sons in hopes they might come home safely, but needless to say, none of them did. So I have to say that the travels were unbelievable. I don't know how they did what they did, but they did it.
Anita, that is just incredible. David, let's hear your family story.
Okay, let me first say this is the spring 2018 edition of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina magazine. And there's a piece that I authored in here that describes my parents' experience. For those of you who want to pick it up and read it and fill in the blanks to what I say, my parents, Paula and Henry Popowski, were both from Kalushin, 50 miles due east of Warsaw. My father was 11 years older than my mother. At the time, my mother's family, Kalushin, by the way, was approximately 10,000 people, 8,000 Jews. My mother's family owned a flour mill there, so they led a little bit above a comfortable life there. She was one of 3 children, my Aunt Hannah, and then their brother Gershon. My father was one of 8 children. The Popowskis were carpenters. And as my father said, I said, Dad, you always said that y'all were so poor, you had 8 children. He said, every child's a simcha. He said, we made another place at the table. That's how we saw things. And so of the 8, 3 survived, my father and 2 brothers that ultimately ended up in Israel. So my father left Kalushin when he was in his 20s, and to work in Warsaw. And at the time the war broke out, my father was conscripted into the Polish army. So he covered all the bases in terms of the Holocaust. He was a member of the Polish army. There was a quick surrender, as you know. He came home. He told the family to get out. 2 brothers went into the woods. Everybody else perished. And when I say they perished, they were shot in Kalushin, either in the open market or the Jewish cemetery. Anita and I were there about 6 years ago, and I was able to say Kaddish at that cemetery. He then went back to Warsaw. He was in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was there during the uprising. And what saved my father was his carpentry skills and his age. So he was of value to the Nazis. And believe it or not, he made it through the Warsaw Ghetto. He avoided Treblinka, where so many went from there. And he went to 3 camps. He went to Plaszów, first Majdanek, and it's sort of a curve as you go south in Poland. And it's Majdanek, Plaszów, which was the Schindler's List camp. And then the last camp he was in Austria, was in Mauthausen, and he was in a sub-camp of Ebensee. Let me insert here, because I see my friend Jane Cohen Kulbrish. We just found out about this 15 years ago. I was in Jane and David's wedding. He is one of my closest friends, undergraduate at Georgia, and roommate for a year. And we just discovered at a simcha in Charleston, I did, talking to Jane's brother, that Jane's father, Aaron Cohen, Captain Aaron Cohen of the United States Army, liberated my father in May of 1945. He was in an army unit that liberated my dad. So let me just insert that there, and I wanted to bring that up. So after he was liberated, my father was liberated, he and two other friends hitched onto a MASH unit. They made their way west, and they ended up in Landshut, Germany, which is in Bavaria, and they started a displaced persons community there. Now, my mother's story was different. My mother, and we'll talk about this later, and you can read a biographical / fictionalized version of it in Beach Music. She was the lady with the coins, and she was one of the ladies with the coins. My Aunt Hannah was with her, and my cousin Myron from New York is on today too as well. But anyway, what happened was my mother went to, my grandfather buried coins on the premises. My mother went to a labor camp. My Aunt Hannah, her younger sister, with a business associate, Polish Catholic, of my grandfather, went to the labor camp, waved at her. She looked around, she ran. They then took the money, sewed it into their dresses and their jackets. And Stanislav Wozniak, who was the business associate of my grandfather, arranged for them to have false papers. And Paula Kornblum became Apollonia Borkowska. And Hanna Kornblum became Hanna Borkowska. And they went to Częstochowa. Many of you may have heard of Częstochowa. It's a little west of Warsaw, with noted for the shrine, the Black Madonna. And there they lived in a convent. And during the day, they worked in a glass factory. Some people knew who they were. Some people didn't. Most people didn't. Some of the nuns knew. Some didn't. The gentleman at the glass factory, a truly righteous Gentile, Michaslav Rilsky, knew the entire time. And so that's what's their daily life, living the lives of Catholic girls, going to confession, going to mass, etc. And they were liberated, fortunately, early in January 45 by the Russians. They went home to Kalashin. The Russians had nationalized the flour mill. They had heard their parents had perished, and their brother who died was a partisan as well in the last weeks of the war. And then they made their way, they hooked up with another family, the Berman family who now live in Detroit, from Kalashin. They made their way west to Schlachtensee, DP camp in Berlin, where Anita's mother was. And I think Henry Goldberg might have been in that one as well, the Goldbergs. But anyway, they heard about my father being in Landshut. They made their way to Landshut. They got to Landshut. My parents married. My brother Mark was born there, and I was conceived there. And I'll stop there for now. And
we're going to come back and get the journey. Lily, let's hear of your parents' experience.
Sure. Thank you, Richard. My parents did not know one another during the war. They met after the war. My mother comes from a very rural area. Yaja Sklars was her maiden name. Comes from a very rural area. She was born in a small town called Vlaschova. And then when she was about 6 years old, they moved to a little larger town, but beautiful, called Benjin. My mother was one of 8 children, and she had multiple grandparents. All of her grandparents were there, her aunts, her cousins, and she always described her pre-World War II experience as very idyllic. It was rolling grounds, lovely town. But it was a very rural area. Her father was a cobbler, a shoe cobbler, who traveled from shtetl to shtetl, fixing shoes and trying to sell some shoes. Her mother, because she had 8 children, was home with the children and always had a pot of soup on the stove. As the rumors of the war picked up and they moved to Benjin, the 3 older children went either into the army or married. So my mother was then the oldest with 4 other children underneath her. And her father decided to take them into the loft of a barn to hide them. Someone told the Nazis about it. And my mother tells a very compelling story about the Nazis coming to this barn, knocking on the attic and demanding that her mother and father and the children come down. There were 7 up there, the 5 children and the mother and the father. But when they asked how many people are up there, her father, my grandfather, answered there are only 6. And they decided to leave my mother, who was the oldest of the remaining children, the most likely to survive, in the attic, and told her to hide in a small trunk that was there. So the father, the mother, and the four little ones come down. She hears them bargaining for the lives of the children, hears some screams, and then is never to hear or see from her family again. We believe they were taken to Treblinka. My mother stays in the attic for what seemed like a day or two. I think it was probably 12 hours. Kind of fixes herself up. She's about 14 years old at the time. Goes downstairs, gets picked up by a Nazi, and concocted a story that she was visiting her Jewish girlfriend, but she was not Jewish. He takes her to a police station. She meets someone who tells her, "You better run, little girl, because you're not gonna make it out of here." And so she slips out of the police station and starts running. But she describes the town is it's just burning up. It's in fire. She gets put in line, and at that point, she gets transported to Auschwitz. And she was transported on August the 5th, 1943, with 512 other people. When she got to Auschwitz, she then lived almost a year and a half, 20 months of going from camp to camp. She was in Auschwitz-Birkenau, she was in Bergen-Belsen, she was in Ravensbrück, and was liberated in Leipzig by the Soviet Army in May of 1945. My father came from a much more urban upbringing. He was born in Kielce and then moved to Łódź in 1930. But in 1939, the family decided to go back to Kielce, hoping that a smaller town would save them. My dad was the youngest of 4 children, and his father was described to me as an entrepreneur. Daddy could never really tell me what he did, but whatever he did, it was an entrepreneur. One of the things he remembers is he did own some kind of a sewing factory and was making army uniforms for the Franco army in Spain. In 1942, the Nazis knocked on the door of the homes in Kielce, which was now a ghetto, demanded that the family come out. His oldest sister, Zosia, was married with a 6-month-old child. They all came out into the courtyard. The Nazis took that 6-month-old baby by the legs, split the baby in front of everybody to see. At that point, the rest of the family was selected to go on to the trains. My dad was put into a labor camp, and he worked in Henrikhof labor camp. He also described having to pick up trash on the ground on his hands and knees, but he'd have to pick the trash up with his teeth. Otherwise, he would get beaten over the head. Finally, in August of 1944, he was transported to Auschwitz from the labor camp. In the labor camp, he actually did a lot of carpentry work, which will come back later to really help my father out. But he went into Auschwitz, and he survived Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Henrikhof labor camp, Oranienburg, and Dachau. He was liberated from a sub-camp in Dachau called Allach by the American Allied Forces on April the 30th, 1945.
What extraordinary stories. Robert?
Yeah, let me ask y'all if y'all can briefly tell us. Let me tell you why, because we're running out of time. You know, one of the things I think we want to know, the audience wants to know, how did your parents get from these DP camps? How did they get from Europe to South Carolina? And so, David, can you briefly tell us that story?
Yeah, Rachel, can you put up
Family photos.
on our thing? The version is this: my mother's family was related to Joseph, distantly related to Joseph and Rachel Zucker of Charleston at the time. And my mother's family, my grandmother's side was 1 of 10 children. My Aunt Miriam, her grand-aunt Miriam, made Aliyah before the war. She wrote to the Zuckers in Charleston, said my mother and my aunt were alive. My mother and my aunt had corresponded with my aunt in Israel. My aunt wrote to the Zuckers. Joseph and Rachel Zucker wrote a letter to the post office, to the last address they have for my parents in Kalasheen, my mother's family. So when my mother and my aunt got back to Kalasheen to look for what the status of things were, they went to the post office and there was a letter from the Zuckers, from Charles. And my mother loved to tell the story, and she corresponded back, and she tried to keep them up with what was going on. And she loved to tell the story. When I first wrote the Zuckers, it was Tanta, my aunt. So many of us have an aunt, Tanta Hanka. She said it was Tanta Hanka and me. And then I wrote another letter, and it was your daddy, Tanta Hanka and me. And then I wrote another letter, and it was your daddy, Mark Moshe at the time, Tanta Hanka and me. So they kept in touch with each other. And ultimately, the Zuckers, Joseph and Rachel Zucker, and let me just show you who they are. In the bottom right picture, you'll see their 50th wedding anniversary. And they're in the middle, the tall gentleman, and to his right, his wife, that's Rachel Zucker. I'll tell you who the other people are in a second.
And what business do they own in Charleston, David?
My parents, the Zuckers owned a furniture store, and then my father came and he worked in construction first, and then he peddled, and then he opened a furniture store.
Okay. Right.
But let me quickly tell you who these people are. Left to right on this, you will see left, my father, Henry. This is in Charleston, in the 50th wedding anniversary for the Joseph and Rachel Zucker. My father, my mother. This is Sarah Kirstein, grandmother of Stephen Steinert and Charles Steinert and Neil Sucker, who I see is on. This is his grandmother and the best friend of Rachel Zucker. This is Joseph Zucker. And these are Jerry Zucker's parents that she's on right now, Moritz Zipporah Zucker and Leon Zucker, who came over from Israel 2 years after my parents came.
So were they sponsored? In other words, the United States government allowed them to come because the family was willing to take them in?
Correct. They sent an affidavit, said that they would support my parents, that my parents would not be a burden to the American taxpayer.
All right, Lily, how did they come from the DP camp after Auschwitz to South Carolina?
Well, actually, Robert, my parents never were in a DP camp.
Okay.
What we had, and this is a good place to show these pictures, after my parents met, and they met through my uncle, who was a bunkmate of my father in Dachau, and when everyone went to find their families, my uncle Ben Sklarz found his sister Yaja in Vlašťova, where everybody went to register. So he brings Yaja back to Munich, Germany, where he and my father were living. And so that's how mother met dad, and that was in September of 45. And in June of 46, they married, and they decided they wanted to leave the chaos of Europe and come to the United States. So my dad remembers that he had an uncle in the United States. Some of you might recognize this, if you could see my cursor, is Gabriel Stern. And so dad remembers he was the youngest of the four. He was responsible for mailing letters to the United States and picking up letters from the post box back home. And Gabe left Europe in the maybe 16 or 17. So he remembers every time a letter came from the United States, his parents would say, see, this is from your Uncle Gabe Stern in Lexington, South Carolina. And you mail this letter back and you tell that post box to get it to your Uncle Gabriel Stern in Lexington, South Carolina. And so fast forward, he's got now a wife, and I was born 18 months after they were married in December of 47. And you see me on the left there with mom and dad. I'm the little bunny with the pink outfit. Dad remembered that he had an Uncle Gabe in Lexington, South Carolina. So sends a letter, no address. It gets to Uncle Gabe. Uncle Gabe reaches out and helps bring the three of us to the United States on the SS McCree. We landed in Ellis Island on June the 8th, 1949.
Did you come to South Carolina?
Immediately, because he was living in Lexington, South Carolina. So that was family. We got on a train. My Aunt Helen, who was Gabe's sister and my grandfather's sister, apparently met us in New York, and we got on the railway and we came right to Columbia, South Carolina.
And Anita, how did your family get to America?
So in 1947, my mother and father's relatives that were with them in the DP camp, which was again in Schlachtensee, and my sister Eva was born there actually in 1946. And anyway, so in 47, my grandmother and my two uncles and the cousin that my mother carried with her, they all left for Israel. My family worked from the minute they got in the DP camp. They all had to have jobs so that they could make money to help them be able to prepare for whatever the next life was going to bring to them. And so my parents were able to help get my mother's family to Israel. And they were going to join them, but there wasn't enough money for all of them to go. And so they had to start saving money again. But then my grandmother wrote back to my mom and dad and told them how difficult life was. They lived in a tent outside of, it was then still Palestine, and, you know, war was coming. And my uncle actually fought in the war for independence in Israel. So in 1949, my parents decided they would just come to America. And my sister was 3 at that point in time. So they, you know, had to get permission, but they were not sponsored by any relatives. They were brought to America by HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And you can see pictures. My father holding the carriage has my sister Eva. And actually, if you could see the whole picture at the top, it says UNRA DP camp. My dad's in a picture with his sister who survived and was in Israel. My grandmother is on the top right, and then my whole family is sitting together, all of us, which was really special.
So
But anyway,
HIAS, the Hebrew Aid Society, yeah,
Yep.
this had been around. This was an organization founded in the early 20th century, right?
yes,
It was an American organization, and so
Yes.
so that's
And
how
brought
your
my
family.
parents.
That's how you. And
Yes,
so
but what was neat about HIAS was they found communities who would resettle your family. So
Right.
originally they were going to send my parents to Youngstown, Ohio, but they said in Youngstown, we're so sorry, we can't take any more Taylors. So find another place to send the Goldbergs. And so they found another place, and it happened to be Jacksonville, Florida. And my parents were sent to Jacksonville, Florida, where I was born a few years later, and my little sister was born later. And they made a life there. People brought them, got them an apartment and gave them an opportunity. The one thing I can say about my parents, they never stopped working. And so that's where life began, Jacksonville.
And the moral of the story is also that these national Jewish organizations sometimes actually do important work. So anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
let me, I think everyone's fascinated how they hear these folks, they've been through this hell. They've been brought to the United States. They don't speak English. They have no money. They have nothing. And they all make a life for themselves. Lily, let's talk about how your parents got started.
Sure. When they came here, Uncle Gabe offered a job to my dad in retail, which was not his forte, not something he enjoyed, not something he wanted to stay in. Because of his carpentry experience that he had in the labor camp, work camp, Henrikoff, he was looking for some kind of carpentry work. And there's a really interesting story about him hitchhiking on a highway and was here in Columbia and was picked up by a truck and a man from either KC or West Columbia named Frank Roebuck. And Mr. Roebuck picked him up, and of course, you know, Dad doesn't speak any English. He spoke 4 other languages, but English was not one of them in the beginning. And so he, with pantomime and demonstration, he indicated that he was a carpenter. And there was one word he did know in English, and that was the word joiner, which apparently has some kind of carpentry meaning about a corner. And Frank Roebuck recognized that. And so he understood that Dad was looking for some kind of a carpentry work, and he happened to own a lumber supply or building supply company. So he gave Dad his card, and shortly thereafter, Dad contacted him and started working with Frank Roebuck at the supply company. If you fast forward a couple of years, by 1954, less than 5 years of being here in the United States, Dad opens up Ben Stern Construction Company. And wouldn't you know that shortly thereafter, Frank Robach came to my father because he had either lost his business with a building supply or quit, not really sure which, and ended up coming to work for my father. So Dad got into first was building residential homes, then went into commercial homes, and then finally got a contract with a big corporation called Southland Corporation that was building 7-Eleven stores and combination with gasoline. And Dad got the contract for the Southeast through Southland to do this building. Mom was a homemaker, so she stayed home raising 3 other children who came after I did. But both of them were very active in the community. And if you could show that one, go back, Rachel, to where my dad is in a motor patrol. If you look at the bottom left, Dad became a member of Mason and then Shriner, and he was part of the motor control. He is the 5th one from the left. You see the shorter one, that's my dad. And I used to watch him in parades, tootling in and out with his motorcycle. He loved it. He was a lay cantor in our synagogue. He was president of our synagogue. And both my parents took leadership roles, especially in the Jewish community, but even in the non-Jewish community. My mom became a docent at the South Carolina State Museum.
Lily, tell us your father's quote, your family loves so much about America as a beacon of hope and opportunity.
Sure. This was something that Dad said at the 50th anniversary. In 1995, there was a statewide commemoration here in Columbia to celebrate 50 years after the war. And I quote, "It would be easy for me to be filled with rage and agony over the human depravity that I experienced in the Holocaust. But when I recall my first sight of the American soldiers entering the camps, it was as though God himself had sent his own angels of deliverance. It was a moment I shall never forget. These brave, precious men giving me the first sign of human compassion and hope in over half a decade of hopelessness. Each and every one of these liberators is blessed and will always be in my prayers."
Great. And Anita, tell us about how your family got started.
Okay, so again, my parents were brought by HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and they were resettled in Jacksonville, Florida. And they lived in an apartment. It was walking distance to the conservative synagogue. And my mom would ice cakes at a bakery and a grocery store. In the middle of the night, she would go to work because, you know, Eva was with my father, and then I was born in 1952. And so my dad would be at home watching and making sure we all slept. Hopefully he slept. And my mom counted inventory because she was really good with numbers. And they were really busy trying to learn English. My mother went first. She learned English first. And then my dad got to learn. She taught him. She learned how to drive a car. And my mom taught my father how to drive a car. While my dad worked every day he worked in the produce department of a Jewish-owned grocery store. And he ultimately became the manager of the produce department. He loved painting signs, so he was really good at painting all of the signs for the cost of the produce before the days that, you know, you had printed things and computers to make signs. But ultimately, my dad decided about 10 years after they'd been in America that he wanted to have his own business. And so my uncle decided to go in the same business, and my father bought a full service gas station, selling fuel, tires, renting U-Hauls and doing repairs. They had to have a mechanic, but my father had to go to school to learn all the skills that he had to learn to be able to own a gas station. And that was his station in the picture on the left. And it's my father, I think the second person might be me, and my mom, my uncle, and my 2 cousins were there. And he had a pure service station in Jacksonville, Florida. And then the next picture, we are celebrating Pesach, and my dad would lead the whole service. And I'm next to my father, and my uncle is on the other side of him, and my mother. And then my sister Eva is sitting at the table next to me. And Pesach was also very important. And then my mom lighting a candle at the Holocaust Memorial in Charleston on Yom HaShoah. She's there in the yellow jacket. And all of these things were so important to my family, but creating that business was the beginning of what allowed them to put 3 daughters through college. And my parents were so happy to own their own business. My mom did all of the bookkeeping. She always was the person who made sure that there was money available to buy what they called a load of gas. And that was really important. And then my mom would listen and learn from the people who surrounded her in life. And she learned how to play the stock market. So she also became the family investor, which was really quite amazing when I think about it. Ultimately, my sister goes to University of Florida. A few years later, I follow her there. But before that, at the age of 10 and 12, I meet the Zuckers. They were my Hebrew school teachers, and they introduced me to Jerry when I was 14. And so when my sister was in Gainesville at University of Florida, my family would love to go there. I always got to go, and I got to see Jerry because he was there too, ultimately. And my sister was great. I got to spend a lot of time with her during those years. And to us, to our parents, to our families, the most important thing in our lives was for us to get educated, because they lost their opportunities to be educated the way each of us had. And they wanted to make sure that we all had that opportunity. And I think that is probably one of the most important things about their coming to live. But anyway, they became friends with the Zuckers and ultimately with the Lippmans, who lived in Charleston. And so really, the web has been woven, and Zuckers, Goldbergs, Popowskis, we all became friends, and Lippmans, and we all got to know each other in Charleston. So my family had a very big connection to Charleston as well.
David, how about your family story of just getting started in America?
Let me begin by giving a shout out to the Banoff family. Rita Banoff, Alan Banoff may be on, and Jane Banoff Bergen may be on. But Rita Banoff tutored my parents in English when they came, and Dottie and Abe Dumas and Joe Dumas. Joe Dumas helped set up the apartment when they came here to America. I'm trying to give you some South Carolina names that the people will relate to here. But so when my father came, he had that carpentry skill, and Nat Schulman, who was the iconic director of the Jewish Community Center in Charleston, arranged for him to have a job, get this, in Somerville in 1950. And he commuted from Warren Street to Somerville every day. And that didn't work. Warren Street, as the Charlestonians will know, is right there in downtown Charleston. And so Mr. Schulman then got him a job with Ernie Gore at Gore Manufacturing. And as people from outside of Charleston will know, the Gore family, very prominent later, and Ernie, a very generous donor to the community. But Ernie was starting out then, and they made fixtures for stores, retail stores, Kmart's, et cetera. And my father worked there. But Ernie and my dad had a language barrier. As my mother said, it wasn't that Ernie didn't understand your daddy, daddy didn't understand Mr. Gore. And so at that point, my father had to make a move, and he began peddling. And he was really one of the last peddlers, because he started doing it in 1951. And I want to read you a wonderful quote here from an interview my mother had. He said he began peddling, and what he would do is he would buy from the wholesalers on Meeting Street and King Street. Among them are Herman Hyman, where Hyman Seafood is. Mr. Hyman had Hanes underwear, et cetera. Moses Resnick, George Green. He would buy from them, and he would go one day to Somerville, one day to Monk's Corner, one day to Allwendale, one day to Johns Island. He had routes. And the vast majority of his customers were in the Afro-American community. He would sell them a lot of goods, shirts, underwear, et cetera. And they would pay monthly on credit. And he would go door to door. And linoleum rugs were also a big item for him. Linoleum rugs. He'd put 3 or 4 of them on the roof of his car and leave every morning. But getting back to the wholesalers, my mother said this about Sam Solomon, who later, Melvin Solomon, took over the business and built the chain of stores. He said that Mr. Solomon gave your daddy a line of credit. And he said to your father, you go and make a living, and you pay me after you sell. First of all, you've got to have a line of credit. And my mother said, Mr. Solomon did that a lot. And that was the kind of help that my parents had in Charleston. And they were fortunate because so many people from Colachine, their small town, had come to Charleston before World War II, Toporic's, Kirstein's, Goldberg's. A third of the Jewish community was from their hometown, and my parents were the last to come. In the left-hand corner, when the shopping centers hit Charleston, first South Windermere Shopping Center, and then Pine Haven, the peddler really became extinct because the customer could get to a retail store. And then my father, with his customer base from his peddling, opened Henry's Furniture Store, and there he and my mother are in front of the store. Now tell me something, look at them. You think they took a vacation? Not one in my lifetime, not one. But they only closed the store for simchas, happy occasions. But other than that, that was it. 6 days a week, half a day on Sunday, he would go out collecting and go see his customers. And that's a picture of us about 1957. Lou Schwartz, who was the photographer of choice in Charleston, took of the 4 children. My 2 sisters were born, Sarah and Martha, in Charleston. All 4 educated. Actually, if you count my brother's a CPA. If you count the CPA as a graduate degree, all 4 of us have graduate degrees, and all 6 of their grandchildren have 4-year degrees as well. That's my parents on to the right, just quickly, with Mark and Landshut in Germany before they came to America. And I've already spoken about the picture at the Zucker anniversary.
Well, we're going to run out of time, so let me ask y'all quickly. Richard has a question, and I have a question. Outwardly, Holocaust survivor families appeared like other families in the Jewish community. You know, David and I were talking before this program about, we knew each other growing up, and I really had no idea that David's parents had been in the Holocaust, really. And y'all were friends with our generation, but your parents had endured hell on earth. How did this trauma manifest itself, if it did, in your family? I mean, how were y'all able to cope, and how were your parents able to cope? You only have a few minutes.
Lily first, yes.
Okay,
Lily.
I judge that I had a happy childhood. I really had everything I needed. What we didn't have was extended family. We didn't have grandparents. We didn't have aunts and uncles and cousins. But I do remember that my mother had nightly nightmares that were always there, always expected. And it would often wake my 2 youngest brothers, or my 2 younger siblings, who were 9 and 11 years younger than I was. And I just so vividly remember meeting my dad in the hallway at night, every night. And he would say to me, Lily, you take care of your brothers and I'll take care of your mom. And Mom had those nightmares until the day she died. It was very, very, very difficult for her. Both of them had anxiety, and you could feel the anxiety, especially when they started to begin to talk about the Holocaust. And we may get to that in a little bit. They had anxiety for days before. They had anxiety nightmares the night of, and then to follow. So, I remember Mom telling me, don't ask your dad for any money. Maybe business was slow, or in the early 50s, late 50s. And that a lot of our clothes were handmade. My mom was a seamstress. And one story I want to tell you is, when I was in high school, there was a brand of skirt called Villager that everybody had. And I wanted a Villager skirt so badly. And I say, Mom, and she'd say, oh, I can make it for you. And there was no doubt she could, but it just wasn't going to be the same. And then she surprised me about a week later and actually bought me a Villager. So, they did what they could for as much as they could. But I think it was mainly the nightmares that I recall, and anxiety at various times of their life.
Richard.
Anita, how about your memories in terms of your family life?
So I feel like faith and family were so important to us, and we became friends with other families who were called the Greena, And we were all those that, they really were the survivors, but they didn't call them that then. But we would get together with them at least once a month, if not more, on Sundays. We always had great outings. But I didn't have the issues with my parents having nightmares, but there was lots of anxiety. There's no question about that, because I can tell you they worked night and day to make sure that their children were supported. And when it came to Baswegians and villager clothes, Lily, I babysat. So I had to earn my money to be able to get my Wegians. But my mother was the most incredible shopper. She knew when all the sales were going to happen, and she made sure there were some villager outfits. But when I was in the 8th grade in home ec, and starting actually at the age of 12, my mom made sure I learned how to sew. In 8th grade, I made what looked like a villager dress in home ec. I will never forget how hard it was, but I wanted that dress with that little flowered material, and I did it all by myself. So I sewed my own clothes and made my own clothes, because we never had enough money for everything. But again, my mom did her best to provide for us. My dad just worked hard. Okay. He came home, he made sure we all ate. My mother prepared food. She had to go to work, and it was hard. But the great part was, once they hit the age of 55, they really had made friends. And there was a club in our synagogue called the Mr. and Mrs. Club. They would go out every Saturday night, and my parents were the absolutely most wonderful ballroom dancers. And that was one of my favorite things, was going to weddings and getting to see my parents, or bar and bat mitzvahs and seeing my parents dance, because they truly were great dancers. And it made me want to dance. And so I danced too. But they had a wonderful social life. And so did my sisters, and so did I. I had wonderful friends, many of whom I am still friends with today from the time I was in the 1st grade. And I didn't go to kindergarten. I started at 1st grade. So I was very lucky to have a wonderful group of friends in Jacksonville that I keep up with till now. And hooray for all the friends I made, because I came to Charleston in 1978. But one cute story, when I was 14, the Zuckers brought me to Charleston. They were really great matchmakers. They brought my cousin, the one that my mom had rescued through the war, came back to America, and we came to Charleston, South Carolina, and they introduced my cousin Esther to Joe Engel. And she dated Joe Engel for a little while, but she was about a foot taller, so she said, I can't marry Joe. But anyway, it was a great experience. And so I've known Joe since I was 14. But they matched me with Jerry as well, right before I turned 15. And then they matched my sister to her husband, Charles, my late sister, who I just lost this past November, who I adored. And we had great lives and great parents who did everything to make our world what it became. And, is there trauma? I'm sure there's trauma that exists within our psyche somewhere. I'm still working to pull out what it did to me. But again, I have to say, my mother always talked about America, the land of opportunities, how critically important it was, and how they tried to take advantage when they got here of everything that was offered to them, every opportunity. And then my mother also talked about Israel, because without Israel, she believed there could be, no safety for Jews anywhere in the world. So we needed to always support Israel, because it was so critically important in our lives. And my mother-in-law, who I'm looking at right now, she's one of those people that helped found Israel by carrying guns under her clothes when she was pregnant with Jerry. So,
David, tell
we
us
had
about your.
I thought a very normal life. I mean, we did.
You didn't seem that normal to me when you were growing up.
Well, I was precocious, but that had nothing to do with the war.
But how did your family cope with the Holocaust and the memories and all the horrible things that had happened?
My father had periodic nightmares. I will say that, and I tell you, it's frightening when it occurred. I can relate to Lily. It wasn't every night, but it was periodic. My mother didn't. I think the therapy my mother had was, she talked to us a lot about the family in Europe, about her war experience, and it was very cathartic for her to do that. And from an early age, she told us about it. And because she didn't see quite the gory details that my father saw in the camps in the Warsaw Ghetto, in the Polish army, my father was very stoic about it all. And it all turned when the television series Holocaust appeared in America. And America was mesmerized by it. And then that is the point, in my opinion, when survivors began to speak about their experiences. But what's interesting about being a child of a survivor and living in a home with survivors, there's a positive side to it. I felt worldly. And I'll tell you why I felt worldly. I felt worldly because English was my parents, and Anita and Lily had obviously the same thing. It was their fourth language. Okay, they spoke Polish, Yiddish, German, English. So I lived in a house with not somebody who was bilingual, was quite, 4 languages. And there are people who spoke 5 and 6 languages. Anita's mother, to her grave, spoke fluent Russian. So we lived in a house of fluency. We lived in a house with people who lived in Poland, Germany, and then the United States lived in that. So we heard about that. We had my father's 2 brothers and my mother's aunt were in Israel. And to piggyback on what Anita said, we watched the news like every family did. And if there's a story about Israel, you could hear a pin drop in the house. We were not allowed to speak. Israel was all important. And they knew more than anybody, the necessity and importance of the state of Israel. And so we grew up with that, and we had pictures of the family from Europe around us. So in the house, we knew the Holocaust obviously existed. We heard a lot about it from my mother, but our lives generally, we played sports, we're active in Jewish organizations, we're active in school, leadership. We all did everything. My sister Martha was on there, was a cheerleader, and my father thought cheerleading was the root of all evil. He hated it.
But David, your parents gave you the life they didn't have as children.
Yes, they did. They didn't have, my mother had a pretty good education over there by European standards.
But I'm just talking about y'all had this they struggled to give you a normal, secure childhood that they were denied.
Yes. Understand now, they weren't children during the war now. My mother was almost 20, my father was almost 30.
Yeah.
But we grew up, they did. They worked, all they did was work, like Anita said. And that was, similar to so many non-survivors as well. But yes, they did. But I think they had a couple of rules. Don't get in trouble. Let me tell you something about parents, survivors as parents. They were tough. They were tough because they grew up in Europe. My father was one of 8 children. There wasn't time for chaos. And we were expected to do well in school. We were expected to be a mensch, meaning get on your feet, go to college, make a living. Okay. And they didn't tolerate, my father used to call it monkey business. Okay. They were very, very strict parents.
Can we, Rachel, could we put up there's a wonderful ETV video that was done some years ago. It's 3.5 minutes, and it has a number of Holocaust survivors. And Lily, you might just sort of echo who those folks are as they're coming on so we can identify them. Rachel, can you pull those up, please?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do that.
Oh, actually, you're doing it, Lily. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
yes.
I sure am. Let's see here. You'll have to hang in there with me. Let's see, just coming on. Okay, let's see if we can't get this to work. Can you see that and can you hear it?
Yes.
This is Rudy Hertz from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina.
The audio is not working very good, Lily. I don't know.
Okay, let me.
I didn't share the fate of the people in the crematoria, but my soul.
How about now?
Yes.
Good.
What I've realized
This is my
after
mother.
searching for so many years, I'm here over 40 years, that human beings are not perfect. And there's always going to be evil. For the majority of people, to study of the Holocaust is very important because we were the victims, but they have to think about it, who are the killers? And if it's one germ in one household, you know that sooner or later it can spread to another household.
The most important thing.
This is Paula Popowski. This is David's mom.
Not to judge the people, what religion they belong to, what nationality they belong to. Judge them by their deeds. Don't single out. Because they were different, they have a different accent. I know I'm never going to lose my accent, and maybe I'm not so proficient in English. But please let them judge by their deeds and not where they came from, and not generalize. That's the most important. Not generalize. Because he looks different, he must be bad.
But you know why you have to know?
This is
You have to
Leo
know
Diamenstein.
this happened there. It can happen anywhere.
He may be from
We
Charleston.
want to make sure that it never happens here. I don't want it to happen anywhere, but you are growing up here. Just remember, stand up for your rights, for your human rights.
I still dream about the camps.
This is Scylla Miller. She lived in Columbia.
And when I leave, I still want to take the sign to wear. After so many years, probably 50 years, I still watch if I need to put on the sign that I'm a Jewish, that I'm Jewish. And I try not to forget the way my parents looked. And my family.
That the Holocaust
This
can
is my
happen,
dad, Ben
and it
Stern.
can happen in the United States, God forbid, as it did in Europe, because most of the people are followers. Most of the people are followers, and if we don't stop the bigotry, the racism, and if we don't stop the prejudices, and if we don't educate the people what happened, this same Holocaust can happen again. And therefore, I am here, and I don't mind having nightmares after my story in order that I can benefit, that the future generations can benefit from it.
Thank you. We can take those down.
Richard,
Okay, yes.
I wanted to ask David, I think the audience wants to know, Pat Conroy wrote Beach Music, which has this Holocaust subplot. So David, how does the Holocaust get connected to Pat Conroy?
All right, let me read some lines from an interview he gave, and I think it'll tell the story. All right, so the interviewer says, you and Williams, this is to Conroy, you and William Styron, both Southerners, have now written major novels using Holocaust material, an area most non-Jews avoid. Is there something that draws Southerners to these stories? Pat replied, Styron was smarter in one way, and that is because his main character in Sophie's Choice was not Jewish. I'm keenly aware of how difficult it is for a non-Jew to write about the Holocaust. This is not material you walk into lightly. I've tried to read everything I could about it. I've interviewed survivors, done a lot of research, count many survivors among my friends. And then he talks about being in Europe and visiting Anne Frank's house. He went to Munich, he visited Dachau. The interviewer then asked, is that when you began to write beach music? Pat replied, I had already written the first few lines of my new book with the suicide of Shiloh Fox, and I really didn't know exactly where it came from or where it was going. And he said, one afternoon I walked into the Peachtree Road, this is in Atlanta, the Peachtree Rotary meeting, actually it was a Peachtree Road race, and a woman started talking to me. Her name was Martha Wade, my sister. And she had a soft Southern accent and talked in a way that led me to believe she was from a society family. She said, Pat, you've got me wrong. I'm Jewish, and I'm not only Jewish, my parents both survived the Holocaust. I said to Martha, you and I are about to become best friends. The first survivors I interviewed were her parents. I attended family funerals and weddings. God bless Patty did. They, meaning our family, was very important to me, and their stories entered deeply into the writing of this book. So that's how the Conroy story came. I want to yield to Richard because
there's more to the story.
Libby was
Well, yeah, Pat was a friend of David's and was a friend of mine. And he had heard that I had a cousin, Libby Shane, who had survived the Holocaust because family members in South Carolina had raised the money trying to bring the entire family over and only saved her. And they had basically tried to bribe the Polish ambassador to the United States to get the whole family over, but apparently he had only bought her freedom. Her parents and brother perished in the Holocaust. Libby was very much part of our family, and the opening story of Beach Music is the story of Libby's being saved. And Pat came to the Friedman family reunion and spent hours with Libby, and later spent additional time with her. He was, Pat was really felt for people who were very different from him, and he deeply felt about people like the Popowskis and Libby. He really felt their experiences. He was a great writer, and the book is really quite moving.
Richard, you think it's time?
Yes,
to maybe people have some questions?
Yes.
Rachel, anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I've got one that's interesting. You all know so much about your family histories, which is wonderful. But were your parents forthcoming about their experiences during the war, or did you need to coax that from them? So often survivors want to suppress their wartime memories and look to the future.
Let's ask Lily first. What's your to that?
My parents did not speak much about their experiences growing up. We knew that they were Holocaust survivors. I knew what the Holocaust was. We saw the tattoos on their arms. We heard the accents in their speech, and of course the nightmares at night. I had to explore, and unfortunately, as the oldest, I feel like I shielded myself from what was probably going to be some very hard stories. And I felt like I needed to shield my parents. I didn't want to do anything that would cause them pain or cause them unhappiness. My role in life, and I see it more as I get older, was to try to keep them happy, that they had suffered so much earlier that we should not do anything that would upset them. Kind of David summed it up well too when he said, there was not a lot of freewheeling, just do what you want to do. I mean, our mission as children was to go to school, do well, make our parents proud. We were going to go to college. We were going to have professions. It was what they never had, and so we were the ones that were going to have it. So I had to pry to get some of the information, and I have to say, unfortunately, there's some that I'm never going to get because both of my parents are now deceased. My mother was ill the last 8 years of her life, so when I did become interested enough and felt like it was safe enough to talk about it, she couldn't give me that information. And my dad died an unexpected death before my mom. So I lost out on what I should have asked earlier, and I didn't, and I will always regret that, but I've had to seek it out.
But Lily, your mother and father, after I think, the Holocaust, David mentioned the Holocaust, began speaking publicly.
They did, but Richard, I never heard them. I never went to hear them speak.
I heard them speak many times,
and they
were
deeply
moving.
Over.
Yeah,
they were
really in tireless voices, and as your dad mentioned, he would have nightmares after giving the presentation, but he did it anyway. It was, I remember many episodes because he was very attached. Both of them were very attached to Selden Smith at Columbia College, where Belinda was working.
Correct.
So she was very engaged with your parents, and they were really extraordinary. I mean, I can remember many of these talks. They just, you'd have a room full of young Columbia College girls, and no one could believe what they were sharing. It was just in disbelief how the cruelty of people could be, you know.
And a point to the Holocaust miniseries, which I do think opened up the world to what happened during the Holocaust. It was in the fall of 1979, and I know that only because I was pregnant with my third child, and I watched that first episode, and I was horrified by what I saw, horrified. And I went to my dad and I said, did this really happen, or is this some kind of fantasy world? And he said to me, Lily, they could never begin to show what we went through in Europe, or else every American TV set would be cut off. This is Hollywood version, but at least it might be enough for people to begin to realize the magnitude of the murder and the torture and the horrendous time that the Jewish people and others suffered during the Holocaust.
I don't want to, yeah, Anita, you wanted to add something?
Sure. Well, I learned about it first by seeing a movie at Sunday school, and I was about 8 years old. So I came home and talked to my mother, and that was the opening of like a faucet. And she always spoke to us after that. She told us so many stories. My father, on the other hand, I didn't have enough time in my life to ask him all the stories and then things I wanted to for some reason. Somehow he was much quieter than my mother. My mother also had trouble speaking. She would get taken by people every now and then and do a presentation, but it was so hard for her. And it was really difficult, but she did it. And recently, my mom passed away a year ago. She was 96 years old, and I was so lucky to have her because we made lots of videos throughout the last 4 years that she was in Charleston. I would go on Sunday mornings and have breakfast and video stories. So I have so many, and they're really special because she told me all these true stories that I never heard the depths of before. I got the details. But a man that had taught high school in Jacksonville said, your mom once came and spoke to my class. It was the first and only time I know of that she actually spoke to a high school class. He sent me the video. So I now have it. And I shared it with my children. And so they've seen it. And it took some work because we couldn't hear the volume, but we've gotten it now to where it's finally in a way that we can hear it. And it is just truly special. First of all, just to have their voices is really special, and to hear the stories from them through the years. It was very important. It has guided my life throughout. I'm a very serious person, and I think it's because of what my parents taught me.
Well, I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
Yeah, Dave, how did your parents, did they talk about it? I mean,
my mother talked about it from the start. And again, because she was in hiding, living in Częstochowa in disguise in a normal life. You know, my father, again, he didn't get into the details. He was in the camps, and the day-to-day life. I mean, I can't begin to tell you the lack of food, the lack of plumbing facilities. Every day they worried. They had to look over their shoulder that somebody would the Gestapo was behind them. My aunt went into confession, and a priest tipped her off to a nun who was was a foe and not a friend, and told her to avoid that person. And so that's my father was like Anita's father in the sense that he didn't talk because it was too horrific to talk about, and I didn't try to bother him about it, obviously. But he did do a video, so anybody who would want to hear more about my parents, they both did tapes and videos. If you just Google Henry or Paula Popowski, you'll see videos of them that were done by various organizations, and he spoke about it. Now, he did write, my father did write for what's called the Yisker book, the sort of history of Kalasheen and their families, et cetera, very thick book. In Yiddish, he wrote a very detailed historical chronology of what happened to him. And it was eloquently translated into English, and we have that. So that's the short answer, I think.
Well, folks, I don't think anybody could help notice that even by Jewish community standards, our guests are like tremendous overachievers. They were the children of their parents. You know, they were given, they had resilient parents who were incredibly courageous, and they had very high expectations for their children, and the children achieved it. It's, you know, really such an extraordinary story. I want to thank everybody. I know this wasn't easy for any of our guests to come in and give this talk. It wasn't easy in the hours of preparation when I spoke personally to each one of them. It was painful to talk about, and I want to thank them because I think they are the voices of their parents now. They, you know, if we're never going to forget, we need to keep telling this story. So I think we got some follow-up for next. Lily, are you or Rachel going to talk about our 2 programs coming up?
And before we leave this, let me just say that we have a state entity called the South Carolina Council on the Holocaust. And if you go to the website, we have over 57 hours of videos of all South Carolina survivors and liberators up until I think it was about 1995. So you can find it there. You can find it at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and there were some very fine videos that were taken on all of our survivors. There are 2 programs coming up. One at the end of this month on April 28th. This is actually sponsored by the South Carolina Council on the Holocaust and supported in terms of advertising through the Jewish Historical Society, and that's the state of anti-Semitism. Our guest is going to be Mark Weitzman out of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in California, and who is the principal author of the definition of anti-Semitism. And then Rachel, I'm going to defer to you to talk about the Rosenwald schools.
We have a wonderful program coming up Sunday, May 16th. Our next conversations is Rosenwald Schools, beginning of the Jewish African American Coalition. Our special guest will be Andrew Filer from Savannah, now Atlanta, who has just published a book of photography of Rosenwald Schools, and Alan Nussbaum, who has been documenting the St. George Rosenwald Schools. If you have not seen the wonderful documentary Rosenwald, we'll be able to air it for 48 hours prior to our program, but it's only for those who sign up. So I'm going to be sending out a lot of materials because it is a marvelous documentary.
Rachel, I think we need to say that Julius Rosenwald, who was the principal in Sears, devoted his enormous fortune. He became one of the wealthiest men in the world to building African-American schools in the South. He built 5,000 schools.
500 in South Carolina.
500 in South Carolina, and they provided the backbone of African-American education. And Dr. Nussbaum and I intend to go over to St. George and interview several of the graduates of the Rosenwald schools. It was, you know, one of many examples, but maybe the most notable example of Jewish philanthropy ever. I mean, it's just phenomenal.
Rachel, I want to comment on this as well. We had a good college friend of my wife's, Myrna Gardner, and she asked Susan and I to watch this Rosenwald documentary, and I have to say it's one of the best documentaries I have ever seen. It's extremely well done and very moving. And so everyone on this broadcast, Rachel, we're going to put up the site where you can watch it 48 hours before our conversation. And it's really an amazing, astounding story. And South Carolina was a big part of it. So we're very excited about it.
It'll be a great program, and we'll be sending out links so you can register. So thank you all again very much for joining us tonight. Thank you to our guests for their words, and to our hosts for always being so prepared for our program.
Thank y'all.
Everybody be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
God bless America.
Thanks so much. It was wonderful.
God bless America.
Thank you.